Yeah, and just telling them how important it is by operating from an empathy first, trauma informed modality. It is not my job to determine whether or not the child in front of me is telling the truth. That's not my role. My role is to hold space and encourage this child to share their story however they feel comfortable doing that. To what extent they feel comfortable doing that.
Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Hey everybody, welcome back, and thank you for joining me for another powerful episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Today, we have a remarkable guest joining us, McCall Allen, a child forensic interviewer from the Barren River Area Child Advocacy Center in Bowling Green, Kentucky. McCall is not only a child forensic interviewer, but also a clinical therapist and a staunch advocate of trauma-informed interview principles that we hold dear on this podcast. McCall's passion for her work shines through as she educates us on the critical role played by child advocacy centers in our communities. These centers provide a safe space for survivors to share their experiences and receive the support they need. The work McCall does is truly remarkable. My podcast has always emphasized the importance of being trauma-informed, and McCall's expertise in this area aligns perfectly with that mission. Trauma-informed interviewing is all about creating a safe and supportive environment for survivors to share their stories. It recognizes the unique impact trauma has on individuals and tailors the approach accordingly. By using techniques that minimize traumatization and prioritize the survivor's well-being, trauma-informed interviewers can gather necessary information from child and teen victims of rape and sexual assault while also promoting their healing and recovery. McCall's dedication to her work is inspiring, and I'm grateful that she's here today to shed light on the critical role of child advocacy centers and the significance of being trauma-informed. Together, we aim to raise awareness and empower our listeners to support survivors in their journey towards healing and providing justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Here's McCall. McCall Allen, thank you so much for joining me. This is an honor to have you here on my show.
Absolutely. Dave, I'm excited about being on your podcast this morning. So thank you very much for asking me to spend a little bit of time with you and your listeners.
McCall, for our audience, could you just go ahead and tell a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yes, I am a forensic interviewer at a child advocacy center in Bowling Green, Kentucky. I've been in this position as a lead forensic interviewer for 3 years. And so what we do here at the Child Advocacy Center is our center in particular covers 10 counties in South Central Kentucky. Any child who resides in any of those 10 counties who has been sexually abused or severely physically abused, they come to us through either law enforcement referral or DCBS, so the cabinet, and that's how we get the children in our building and get them into our services. And so they come to me to be interviewed. And then we also here at the center, we have 4 therapists that are trained specifically in trauma-focused CBT. Most of the children who I interview then end up going through that therapy process. And that's a very specific therapy modality that is tailored for children under 18 who have been through a traumatic event such as sexual abuse, physical abuse, witness to murder, that sort of thing.
McCall, you have a really hard job.
There are lots of days that are hard, but there is also, on the flip side of that, many, many days that are incredibly rewarding.
Yeah. Well, I remember back from my detective days doing the same thing. I did my own interviews, but I used a child advocacy center, so I'm very familiar with what they are. Can you kind of describe for our listeners a little bit about what a child advocacy center is and how they work?
Sure. The National Child Advocacy Center is located in Huntsville, Alabama. And so that is where I went for my initial training prior to starting interviews. My background is actually I'm a mental health therapist. So I'm a licensed clinical social worker and did many years in family practice, that sort of private practice therapy setting. And then when I started here at the center, I went to training in Huntsville. And so there are child advocacy centers all over the country. What is really special about the model that we're built on is that it's built on a multidisciplinary team model. And so what that means is we all get to come together as a team. So every center has advocates that work with children and families, keeping in touch with them even after they have received services from our buildings to get those children and families. If it's not therapy with us, therapy somewhere else. If they need medical attention after they've had an exam with us, we can put them in touch with medical providers and just different resources in the community and on a state level as well. We come together around the children and families, our employees at the center, but then also law enforcement and social services. If we need to get school personnel involved, we do that to make sure that we are surrounding these children and these families with as many resources as we can so that they feel supported. Because when children and families get to us, this is the most vulnerable time and experience that they've ever had. It's sad to say, but a lot of them, even before they get to us, have had experiences where they haven't been believed or haven't been directed in the direction of the right resources. So it's really cool that we get to work as a team with all of our different disciplines to come together to surround these children and families.
In the facility I worked at in Boulder County, it was called Blue Sky Bridge. It was a soft interview room, more or less like a living room or a child's playroom. Is that much the kind of setup you have also?
Yes. So actually, I'm biased, Dave, but I love our building. So our building has such an incredible history. It's actually an old Methodist church, which is very cool. And it's in the west part of our town, which I also love. We have 2 interview rooms that the advocates bring the child upstairs and let them pick their own interview room. When kids come to us, a lot of times they feel like everything around them is spiraling out of control. It may seem like a small choice to us, but the very choice of them getting to choose what room they get to tell their story in is a really big deal and gives them a sense of empowerment, like they do have a choice in something. So one interview room has, we call it the grade school room. It's kind of geared toward those elementary age kids. It has a table, there's Play-Doh, coloring books. I always leave a note, like a legal pad in each interview room, just because some children and adolescents would prefer to write their responses, because to verbally say and speak of the horrific abuse that they've endured is too much for them. In our state, it may be different elsewhere, but in our state, that is allowed per statute, as long as I read it for the record and then ask clarification questions. So we leave paper in there, colored pencils. And then in the other room, the adolescent room, we have really big comfy chairs and it's geared more towards the olders. We do have some older coloring books and that sort of thing, but they're set up just slightly different. But again, the child can choose whatever room they want. So nice. Yes, in our waiting room and lobby, we have a couple different waiting rooms in there. Like you said, like a living room. We don't want it to feel like you're walking into a doctor's office. We want it to be very comfortable for these kids and families.
And then what about the recording of those interviews? I'm guessing you do have recording facilities or equipment to do all of that.
Yes, we do. So each interview room is set up with 2 different cameras in the rooms, and we are very open with the children. And the advocate, when she brings them up to the interview room to choose which room they would like, she points out the cameras and explains to the child who are allowed to watch this video, who will have access to it. We're not trying to hide anything from these children. I tell every child and adolescent that comes up here, I will never have any interaction with your parent, guardian, any of your family members, because that's not my job. That's not my place to tell your story. And I tell them, you get to choose who you trust with your story. But then I also tell them in our monitoring room, law enforcement is there, a social worker is there, and the advocate is there. So we're also very open with them about that those are the only people that are watching and listening to our conversation. I also never use the word interview with kids or teenagers. To me, that just sounds very more like an interrogation and very formal. To me, that just doesn't foster the sort of conversation and environment I would want to be in if I were in their situation. When I go downstairs to the lobby to get the child and bring them upstairs, I introduce myself and say, I'm the one that you're going to be hanging out with for a little bit. I do about 90% of the interview, and then I take a break with the child. And I tell them this as we're starting the interview. I tell them, I say, listen, we might be in here for a little bit, but pretty soon we're going to take a break just because you might need a minute. You might need a restroom break. You might just need a second to breathe, and that is okay. I'll run down the hall and I can grab you something to drink and a snack. But if you need a break before then, absolutely let me know. Whenever we do end up taking that break in the interview room, I go down the hall to the monitoring room, check in with law enforcement and social services and ask them. Then we kind of have a huddle. What other clarification do you need? What other questions? What other details do I need to discuss in the interview? Is there any social media, Snapchat handles, an account, that sort of thing for the record, any address that can be remembered, that sort of thing. So that's the time that I do that huddle. And then I take those questions back to the interview room and just start that conversation again.
Right. And then after that interview is completed, your role isn't over.
It is not.
Tell us what happens then.
I will wrap up the interview. I always explain to the child that a lot of times when kids come up here, there are some things that they may have been nervous to talk about or scared to talk about, and that's okay. But I let them know that at any point in time, if there was something that they weren't ready to talk about today, they can always come back here. This is a safe place that I will never ask any questions of why you didn't tell me that before. That's not important to me. What's important to me is that you share your story when you're ready and when you feel heard and when you trust the person you're telling. I always want kids to know that they can return here because that does happen a lot. Kids will come here and, they're just putting out a little bit to see how then that is played out. Because one of the heartbreaking parts of the system in which I work within is that kids will put out a little bit of a disclosure and then nothing's done. We have different agencies have this criteria they have to meet in order to help, to what extent they are going to help that child. If the child doesn't think it's worth it after they put a small disclosure out, if nothing changes, then why would they put more of a disclosure out? It puts them at risk. So I always leave that kind of out for a child. And that's really important to me. I never want a child to think that I didn't tell everything. I can't go back. That was my one shot. So I always close my interviews with that. And also just instilling a sense of empowerment into those children. Dave, the bravest people that I have ever met in my life have sat across the room from me in one of those interview rooms. And I tell them that, and I sincerely mean that, because they are sharing with me the most horrific things that no person, adult or child, should ever witness or experience. It's important to me that I hold space for that and acknowledge that in front of them and tell them how proud I am of them. A lot of kids that are here have never heard that. No one's ever been proud of them. And that's a huge deal. So at the end of the interview, I do go through some of that. And then I always make sure that whatever questions they have, ask me anything. And I don't want them leaving with a lot of questions. Our law enforcement agencies in our area are phenomenal with these cases, and they're always very open to talk to these kids after the interview. After we wrap up in the interview room, I take the child downstairs. Again, I never have any contact with the family member, guardian, or foster parent that brought them. And then I come back upstairs to our monitoring room where law enforcement and the social worker and our advocate are. And then sometimes some law enforcement agencies, they also have a victim advocate. And so we all kind of huddle up and decide, okay, right now, before this child leaves the building, what's the next best step for the child? Does the child need a medical exam? We have 4 doctors in our community that volunteer to come here once a week and do medical exams. And so we're obviously on call 24/7. And so if there's an emergency, those doctors are on call as well. And so if the child needs a medical exam, do we need a therapy referral? Do we need what next steps so this child isn't walking out of here not knowing what the next part of the plan looks like, because that's important. To give them some sort of structure. So we huddle up, and then the advocate and law enforcement go down and have their conversations. And then I obviously do my documentation. And then at that point, I usually don't hear anything about the case other than our case staffing and that sort of thing. I typically don't hear anything about the case until I get a subpoena, if the investigation goes that far.
When you say you do your documentation, do you have to do a full write-up of the entire interview, or is the recording enough? Tell us about your paperwork.
Each center is a little different, and I feel very fortunate in that way that I can kind of decide how I want my documentation to look. My documentation is strictly internal. I don't have a problem sharing it with law enforcement, but I typically don't, because my documentation is not nearly as detailed as listening and watching a recording of the actual interviews. It would be my fear that if I share my documentation, then that would be all that would be considered. And that's not doing justice to the child. I definitely want the interview to be watched by whoever's involved in the investigation. But in terms of my documentation, I write up a synopsis. We use that. We have monthly meetings with, we call them MDT meetings, multidisciplinary team meetings, with every one of our counties. And we go through every single open case in that county. Sometimes in our bigger counties, those monthly meetings get very long. It's important that my documentation is detailed and appropriate for that meeting, so that the advocate who's on that meeting representing the center and that child can say, okay, here are McCall's notes from that interview. Here's what we need to know. And so that's really the only purpose for my notes, is for that team meeting.
Okay, sure. Mm-hmm. But then sometimes you do get a subpoena, and
I do.
The court is knocking at your door and you have to go. Tell us about, well, let's backtrack a little. Let's talk about how we met. And that is,
yes, I completely forgot to mention that.
That's okay.
Yes,
that's okay. This is a great segue into how we met. And we don't have to talk about the case. We just need to talk about what you do, who was involved, and how you and I got connected.
Recently, I testified in a case. It's a couple of years old, just because that's how the court system works. Nothing moves fast. And so I recently testified in a case that our Attorney General's office took on to prosecute in one of the counties that we cover. The prosecutors from the AG's office was Tim Cocanougher, which is a very dear friend of yours, Dave.
Right. Yep.
So Tim and I made that connection and just hit it off. It's not every day you run into someone where you can have conversations about trauma-informed interviewing. And I feel very fortunate to have met Tim and worked with him in that capacity. And then he put you and I in contact, which I'm so grateful for. So when he sent me your podcast, I was like, oh, this is fantastic. So, and obviously listen to Tim's episodes, because they are wonderful and such a great resource. But yeah, that is definitely how we met.
Yep. Tell us a little bit about the court process. Are you ever called to the stand then to testify about that interview? And is the interview admissible, the video recording and audio admissible in the courtroom? Because in some states it is, some states it's not. Tell us about that process.
No matter what type of case you're dealing with, court is grueling, and it is important. I've had to learn this, and I'm still learning this. I think every time I do take the stand and testify to my interview protocol and to the procedure and to behaviors. Mostly when I'm on the stand, I talk about body language, my procedures, the questions I ask. I try anytime I can, because in Kentucky, we can't use expert witnesses. I try to use my testimony to educate the jury as much as I can creatively, because the general public just doesn't understand. They don't understand trauma-informed interviewing, and the body really does keep the score, and how that plays out literally in front of my eyes as I'm interviewing a child and adolescent. Just their body language tells so much. And, I always get asked about, why do children recant? Why do children not tell you everything all in one interview? And in terms of the interview itself being played, I have never been part of a case that I testified in where the entire interview was played. It can be, that just has not been my experience. Now, I have testified in cases where the defense will ask me a question and I will request that they play that part of the interview, because one, I just think that that's helpful. And two, it just really helps me remember. I'd never want to obviously misspeak or misrepresent anything. Sure. They will absolutely do that. When I testify, I don't speak directly to what the child says. It's really just about me as an interview, my protocol, and how we kind of operate as a center. Just kind of like the questions you asked me at the beginning. Why do kids come to me? The defense always asks, how many times do kids come to you and not tell the truth? That sort of thing. So doing their jobs as defense attorneys, but then spending my time on the stand debunking that.
Sure. Talk a little bit about the comment you made a minute ago. You said a lot of your testimony is an opportunity to educate the jury. Mm-hmm. Tell us what kind of education you are most interested in making sure the jury is educated on, they need to know most about.
Sure, absolutely. And I will tell you, Dave, I learned so much of this a couple of weeks ago in that trial that Tim and I worked on together. I take the stand and prosecution asked me questions. They asked them in a way that really opens up some space so I can talk to the jury about walking into that interview room with empathy first. Yes, if I believe a child, I'm going to tell them that I believe them because that's important, and really explaining to the jury the impact of that vulnerability in that room and the impact of the trauma that the child has endured, especially over an extended period of time, that it would be normal that a child would not be able to extrapolate 8 different detailed incidents if it happened over 5 years. And I also spend a lot of time too explaining child development in that way, that I couldn't tell you the last 5 places that I used my debit card. So I don't know that it's okay for us to expect that of a child in recounting their sexual abuse encounters.
No, great example for our audience too, to listen to that and hear that whole process. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just telling them how important it is by operating from an empathy first, trauma informed modality. It is not my job to determine whether or not the child in front of me is telling the truth. That's not my role. My role is to hold space and encourage this child to share their story however they feel comfortable doing that. To what extent they feel comfortable doing that.
Hey, SAS listeners, we're very fortunate to have with us in the studio today Sierra Lancaster. Sierra is a representative of our sponsor, Unique Makeup and Beauty Products. Welcome, Sierra. I'm glad you're here.
Hi, happy to be here.
Tell us a little bit about Unique.
Unique is an awesome company. Our mission is to uplift, empower, and validate women. We have everything from makeup, skincare, collagen, basically any beauty item you're going to want.
Awesome. And how long have you been involved with Unique?
I started with Unique in September of 2019. I had a friend who was involved. She was a presenter, and I just watched her transformation and how confident she became, and I loved it, and I wanted to be able to do that for myself and to help other women with that.
I love hearing that. And the reason I chose Unique as our sponsor is because there's a tie between what SAS, Sex Assault Survivor Stories podcast is doing and what Unique is doing. Tell us a little bit about that connection and why Unique and SAS go together.
Yeah, so SAPREA is the foundation that goes along with Unique. SAPREA exists to liberate individuals and society from child sexual abuse and its lasting impacts. 1 in 5 children in the United States are sexually abused before the age of 18, which needs to stop. And so SAPREA is there to help prevent that and also to offer hope and healing for those who have experienced it.
And what does SAPREA offer to your clients?
SAPREA has a retreat. It's called the SAPREA Retreat. This is a 4-day retreat that survivors can go to get the help that they need to continue their healing process. And then afterwards, they are given resources like therapists and phone calls and support groups that help them to continue with their healing.
So if our listeners want to know more about that, can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, they can reach me or they can go to saprea.org and we can include my contact in the show notes. They can reach out to me and it is a free retreat for survivors. It's all provided through donations. And so there's donations that you can, of course, make just monetary donations, or any purchase from my website gets 10% of the profits are donated directly to the SAPREA Foundation.
That's great. One of the things that I think I'm really impressed with, you mentioned earlier of the idea of how Unique has helped your confidence. And that leads me to asking you about your confidence growth and the fact that you've just started a podcast yourself.
Yes, I have. So it's called Confidently Beautiful with Sierra. And the purpose of that podcast is just to show everyone that they already have the confidence inside them and we just need to bring it out.
I love that. Thank you again for being here.
Yep, of course.
We'll have you back sometime.
Sounds good.
McCall, it's striking to me to hear you as a child forensic interviewer talk in the same terminology that I talk to adult survivors and victims in, using the same language, telling them that my whole purpose in interviewing them is to give them a platform to tell their story, but to tell it any way they feel comfortable telling it. I want to interject here that the trauma-informed interview process, and I call them trauma-informed interview principles, are derived from child forensic interview techniques. And we learned a lot in the process of learning how children relate their story on how to ask those same types of questions to adults. So I think it's really great to hear you talk about that trauma-informed approach. And I, too, teach the same thing you just mentioned, that the first most important aspect is that empathic approach, listening and believing.
Absolutely.
We have to give a demeanor that we definitely believe them because
Absolutely.
It keeps them talking.
It absolutely does. The questions I go in and ask, and Dave, I know this is how you operate as well, even with adults. Yes, some questions have to be when, where, the logistical things, but tell me more about that time in the bedroom. Tell me about a time that was different. Okay, tell me another time that was different. I want it to be a conversation. I'm a huge believer in narrative therapy. And so this is just a verbal narrative response that they're giving me. I have a practice of never asking the question why. I will forego a question if I have to begin with. I just don't like the tone that sets. It seems heavy to me in this room where I'm trying to create an insanely strong sense of empathy and compassion and a sense of that child being heard. And if I'm asking you why, I don't feel like that helps them feel heard.
I totally agree with that. In fact, I teach this very topic. I probably spend 30 minutes, sometimes an hour, on why asking why isn't appropriate. I tell my audiences when I'm doing training and presentations that why often implies a sense that you may not believe them, but it also implies that they did something they shouldn't have done, or they didn't do something they should have done.
Right. Yes.
I think a more appropriate question, if why is in my mind, and one that actually elicits more information than specifically asking why, and that is, what are you able to tell me about your thoughts when you did what you just told me about? What
Yes.
were your thoughts about that?
I think that is a really good segue into a conversation with a victim and getting those sensory details, which are gravely important, especially if you start with the end in mind. And I just assume every case is going to court, then those sensory details are so important to a jury. If that child tells me how something tasted, smelt, felt, what they heard, if they had physical pain, if they can describe the way the blanket felt on top of them, the jury can place that victim there. You know, in the last case that I testified in currently is 19, but when the abuse occurred, it started from when she was 12 to 17. The victim even said after the trial was over, the defendant was acquitted, but she looked at me and she said, you know, the jury didn't see the 12-year-old girl who was being sexually abused by her dad. What the jury saw is a 19-year-old who's getting ready to be a new mom, who has a full-time job. And I think that's very hard. I don't know how you fix that or if you can, but I think those sensory details, eliciting those in a forensic interview is so important for that reason.
Very much so. I totally agree with everything that you're saying. Not only does it give the opportunity for that victim to express a whole lot more detail, but those are the experiences that are recorded strongest by the limbic system in a traumatic situation that a child or an adult goes through. And so to not ask those sensory questions, I think is a disservice to not only them in expressing their story, but in providing justice for them. It goes back to what you're talking about, the body keeping the score. And most victims and survivors want to tell their story. They just don't know how oftentimes. And
Yes.
I think what we're talking about here with this trauma-informed approach is so critical. It's very comforting for me to sit and talk with you. I think you've brought up some amazing points. That's why I wanted you on, was to show those correlations. It's really important to be trauma-informed. I'm so excited to hear you bring up those things that are so critical in interviewing victims of sex assault and rape.
Yes.
McCall, do you ever have the need to interview adults? Oftentimes in an investigative scenario, you might interview a child who's 15, 16 years old, quits talking, doesn't want to talk anymore, or later decides, I want to prosecute, I want to see what we can do in court. But now they're 19, 20 years old. Do you interview those aged people again?
That's an interesting dynamic. I'm at the very early stages of conversations with our law enforcement, specifically in our county. Warren County, where I am housed, is our biggest county that we serve. And we have a really great professional relationship with the city police department here. Typically, how that would work is an officer or a detective, they would interview that victim as an adult. I would like to at least be able to give that victim the choice. Again, I think that's powerful to have choices, despite the fact of them being adult, if they would feel more comfortable coming here. Typically, the answer to your question, Dave, is no, I would not interview an adult. Caveat to that, I do interview adults if they're medically fragile. I've done several of those. If adults are on the autism spectrum, I will interview those adults as well. So there are those mental health and medically fragile situations. But I think giving those victims the choice if they come forward with more as an adult, I think that's powerful. But to answer your question just directly, currently the police department would do those.
Is there a policy that prevents you from interviewing an adult? Obviously, there's some sort of provision that if necessary, you can have an adult at the facility.
Yes, absolutely. In terms of that, our policies and statutes are very fluid in that way. I've even gone to facilities to interview, medically fragile adults. So yes, things are very fluid in that way, which is really great that we have that leeway.
For sure. McCall, what would your response be if law enforcement were to call you and say, McCall, you've done a lot of my child sex assault interviews. I've got an adult, but I don't feel comfortable interviewing them because I'm not as trauma informed as I'd like to be, or I haven't been trained in trauma informed interviewing. Would you be willing to come do my interview for me? Would you do that type of a situation? Do you have the leeway from your agency to do that kind of thing as a professional assist?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, I would be very honored that they would ask me to step into their investigation in that way. I think that's a very big compliment that they would trust me with their victim. And so, yes, I would absolutely. We work from a victim-centered perspective. And so if the victim feels more comfortable with someone different conducting the interview and holding that conversation, I think that's what we do. I think it's important to have a little bit of self-determination there. Again, as long as there's no harm to the victim and everyone is trained and professional, then absolutely. I would love to do that. That's what I hope at the start of those conversations is that I hope that becomes the norm in our counties in the future, that can just be kind of the protocol.
Well, maybe getting the word out through this podcast will help.
Yes, absolutely.
Can you tell us, were you a clinical therapist? And tell us about some of those experiences of your educational background and what you've done work-wise.
Sure, absolutely. I have my master's in social work. I graduated from college, spent some few years working, and then in an unrelated field, and then came back to get my master's in social work and went right into private practice as a mental health therapist in a private practice setting. I worked with a few larger agencies in our community, and then the last 4 years of my private practice career, I opened up my own private practice and just saw adolescent females and adult women. When I first started in private practice, I saw mainly children, and it was mainly children that were on what we have in our state called the Michelle P. waiver. These are youth and adolescents who are kind of transient in terms of in and out of foster care. They're not with their biological parents typically. Some of them are medically fragile. I'd spent the first part of my private practice working with those children. I would at the start, it was protocol then that we would go into the schools. I did that for about a year and I didn't feel good about that. I know that there's a strong place and a lot of good work done in school-based mental health, and I'm so grateful for that movement. But I found with my clients that was difficult to do school-based therapy, to go into their environment, see them for therapy in their environment, and then put them back in their environment with their peers. I didn't think it was beneficial or effective for either the child or myself. I stopped doing that pretty early on in my career and found other ways, whether we met at the Boys and Girls Club or their grandparents. I didn't care at that point. I just didn't think that school was where I needed to be. So,
well, it actually sounds kind of like a trauma-informed approach even there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell us about your trauma-informed education and how you became trauma-informed. Was that just through your school education, or was there some additional specific trauma-informed training?
Having my master's in social work, the social work discipline is very client self-determination. I think the social work part of my education started the ball rolling with me stepping in empathy first. It wasn't explicitly taught that way in grad school, but that's what I took away from that. And that's how I kind of molded it into my own practice and how I carried myself as a therapist and interacted with not only the child, but their families or foster families or whoever I needed to interact with alongside of that child. And then I did go through training for trauma-focused CBT. There, I went in Lexington and did a week-long training, the same training that our therapists here at the center go through. I did that before I started interviewing because the director of our center actually was trying to recruit me as a therapist. So I went through that training, and really, Dave, it was a hard decision. I didn't think that I could carry those cases consistently all the time in a way that served those kids best. I didn't feel at that point in time that I had the capacity to carry those, because that's the process of going through TFCBT is a very lengthy process, and it's very intense. It's very caregiver involved, which is nice. And we have this whole graduation for the kids. Once they finish, it's a really big deal that we celebrate. I just didn't think at that point in time that I wanted to carry just those cases all the time. And so I didn't. I told the director it wasn't going to be a good fit. Then I didn't hear from her for a few months. And you know how you do with big decisions. I was second guessing myself. I'd never really worked with victims in that way. And that was intriguing to me. I felt this, it just wouldn't quiet in my heart. I wanted to learn more about working with victims. I wanted that experience. So then thankfully, she reached back out to me and said, I know you're a therapist, but maybe we need an interviewer. Could you come and just try this out? I didn't even know, Dave, that this was a job that someone had. Yeah. I'd never, ever been to the Child Advocacy Center in my community. Didn't know what they worked towards or what their goals were or anything. So it was just, doors opened, and I'm very fortunate in that way.
Seems to be a perfect fit.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm lucky to do this job and walk alongside these people.
I'm really excited and happy and glad that you're there and that you're doing what you're doing and that you are as trauma informed as you are. On most of my interviews for this podcast, I ask my survivors, victims, in closing, what they do after an interview like this to take care of themselves. And I know this hasn't necessarily activated any trauma for you, but vicarious trauma is a huge aspect of your life, I know, and other therapists' lives and first responders' lives. Are you willing to share with our audience some of your coping techniques and some of your own self-care techniques and practices that you do to take care of trauma you absorb from all these children and some adults?
Yes. Well, it's funny you ask, because at 1:00 I actually have a therapy appointment. So again, my center, the people here are so wonderful to me, and we really work in a really healthy environment. We realize and understand the heaviness of the work that we choose and are lucky enough to take on, but we also know that we all need an outlet for that. So just to be very honest with you, every Wednesday at 9:00, I'm in Nashville, Tennessee for therapy. Because since I became a therapist, it is also my firm belief that the best thing that I can do for myself, but also for anybody who stands or sits in front of me, is to do my own work. That is how I can be the best I need to be and hold the space I need to hold for these children and victims, and also just to show up for my people in my personal life. I also need to do my own work for those people, but mainly and selfishly for myself, so I can then show up for those people. So therapy is definitely my go-to. But also, I think that having, not only with the people you work with, but I'm very open about what I do. Sex abuse is not glamorous. Sexual assault cases are not the cases that the Commonwealth attorney and the county attorney are really wanting to take on. They're not glamorous like drug cases and trafficking cases. But it needs to be talked about. And so I kind of, in my personal life, make that my thing. Like, this is something we're not going to dig our heads in the sand and act like this doesn't happen. It's important. We need to know that this goes on in our sweet little community. It does. Absolutely not about specific cases, but just this is a reality in our community. And we need to, as a community, join together for these victims. Whether or not we realize who these victims are, we need to come together for them and not turn our heads away when someone talks about this. So I think that is very helpful to me. And anytime I can be outside, just a very basic self-care, I can just sit outside on my back porch or get my hands in some dirt, acknowledging that what we do is heavy. Just because I seemingly have it all together in that interview room does not mean that I can't then go downstairs to my coworker and say, this is really hard. This is really hard work. I promised myself that if there was ever a time in this job that I stopped crying, that if there were an extended period of time where I didn't go home and just cry about a case, I don't need to be here. Yeah. Because I think it's very easy in what we do and what law enforcement does and social services. You're just bombarded with this. And so then it becomes your norm. And so nothing surprises you. And I don't want to become hard in that way.
Right.
I don't cry in the interviews or anything like that, but I just think it's important that I still feel their words in a powerful way. Mm-hmm. And I will be here until I don't.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how I self-care.
Well, I'm glad, and I'm happy to hear that. The last thing you want to do is take these kinds of issues home and let them be manifested out on your own children and your spouse and significant others and people that you interrelate with on a personal and social level. It's really important. I'm glad you talked to us about that. Thank you so much for being with us. You've provided us with a lot of information that I think applies to not only the child victims that may listen to this, but also those adults who hear this and know that trauma-informed approach is the best way to talk to anyone. And so I'm very thankful for your job, for your person in doing what you do and having that passion and zealousness to do it and do it right. So thank you so much. McCall, would you be interested at all in maybe coming back and talking to us again?
I would be honored to talk to you and your listeners again. It has been a pleasure to talk with you and learn more about what you do, but also get a chance to talk to your listeners. So thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. It was an amazing experience to have the opportunity of talking in depth with McCall Allen about her work, her aspirations, and her self-care process. And I want to give her my deepest appreciation for the time she spent with me. I hope you, my listeners, gained some insights and education on the critical role that McCall and other forensic interviewers have in the lives of children who've been raped or sexually assaulted, in addition to how important it is for professionals in the criminal justice realm to be trauma-informed. I want to give the invitation once more to those of you who've been raped or sexually assaulted and are ready to share your story with others in the pursuit of furthering your own healing and providing some guideposts in helping others heal. Just email me at davemarkel@gmail.com. That's DAVEMARKEL@gmail.com, and we'll talk about the possibility of you being on one of my episodes. I also want to express my gratitude to both my regular listeners as well as those of you who are hearing this podcast for the first time. The time you've spent with us here is greatly appreciated, and I hope you've been uplifted, inspired, and educated by McCall's interview. Please tell everyone you know about this episode and this podcast. And don't forget to rate this episode and subscribe to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Your rating and subscription help this podcast grow, and you'll be doing your part to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Another way to do this is to start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been affected by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.